Pode tudo.
Muito bem, boa noite a todas e todos. Satisfação enorme receber a professora Leslie Armijo, perdão, receber aqui na Universidade de São Paulo. Falávamos agora há pouco, seria uma satisfação enorme recebê-la pessoalmente, professora. Da próxima vez tomamos uma caipirinha junto aqui em São Paulo. Será uma honra enorme. Falar muito brevemente o currículo da professora, mas antes agradecer o professor Rogério Hernandes pela coordenação dos seminários, em nome da área de Relações Internacionais. Agradecer à professora Janina, seu trabalho aí incansável para promover a área, e a professora Leslie, que é vamos dizer, uma parceira da Universidade de São Paulo há muito tempo, né? Posso até dizer que é uma uspiana, o tanto que já contribuiu, colaborou com a nossa universidade. A professora Leslie é professora da School for International Studies, Simon Fraser University, e do Global Development Policy Center da Universidade de Boston. Foi professora visitante do IRI, né, professora em 2015, é membro do Research Committee de Economia Política Internacional da IPSA, e seus principais temas de pesquisa são International Comparative Public Policy, South American Regionalism, Democracy and Markets, Financial Statecraft e Emerging Powers and the BRICS. Eu acho que principalmente nesse tema, né, professora, sobre as coalizões emergentes que nós temos cruzados aí nossas agendas de pesquisa. Mais uma vez, muitíssimo obrigado, e passo a palavra aí para a professora sobre o tema tão importante de hoje.
Ok. Boa noite. É uma honra enorme espero que daqui a pouco possa aparecer pessoalmente. But since it's been a long time, I'm going to speak in English. And Janina gave me permission to introduce myself with my T-shirt.
Yes.
I know I'm honored that all of you who have an important election coming up have the ability to stop and listen to me. We also have an important election coming up in the United States, and I'm actually physically in the United States, even though I'm affiliated in Canada. And I've been out every weekend going door to door and wearing my T-shirt everywhere. So good luck to all of us. With that, let me start. I would much appreciate a 10-minute warning. I've just started a timer for myself, but it doesn't always work right. So let me know when I'm getting near the end of my time. The title of my talk, let me put this on full screen now. There we go. The title of my talk is Orchestrating Governance, Can South America Provide Regional Public Goods? And the big takeaway, I think, is that yes, probably, maybe, and moreover, the most important regional public good in the present international context is regional cooperation itself, either regional or sub-regional, for South America, for Mercosur, for Latin America as a whole. All of those things are, costly, non-excludable, and non-rival. Okay. So the overview is the following. I'm going to start with an apologia, a justification for why I'm approaching the topic as I do. Then I'm going to talk about why seek regionalism, then world structural systemic trends in international relations and international political economy, implications for Latin America and South America, and then is it fair to compare Latin America with Western Europe? and finally, modes of regional problem solving. So the apologia is, I'm not really going to talk about what you might have thought I would. That is, I'm not going to talk about the details of regional governance, even though I think it's important. And I did include a paper where that's the introduction to a book on regional governance in specific policy arenas. But honestly, it's been a while since I've been to Brazil or South America. I think details, anecdotes, and depth are best seen from inside. But what I can do as an outsider is see big structures and big trends. So that's what I'm going to talk about. So really, this is regional governance with an international relations eye. I'm going to assume what I would call a soft rationality assumption. That is, if there are net benefits from changing course, then most actors will at least try to change their behavior. I think that's a reasonable assumption. Okay, so why seek regional public goods? There are two big reasons. One is what we might call addressing regional policy challenges. In other words, solving joint problems that you can't solve as a single country: river basin management, dealing with pandemics, dealing with migration issues, regional infrastructure, and coordinating positions regionally or sub-regionally towards global governance organizations, say in the climate talks or on debt issues. A second reason to seek regional public goods is because the external environment, the global environment, may have shifted. In other words, as a response to big structural systemic shifts in international political and economic relations that raise the cost to sovereign states of going it alone. So rather than talk about the first, which you will all have thought about a lot, I'm going to talk about the second most of the time. So what do I mean by global structural systemic shifts? There are two kinds of shifts that have gone on, say, in the last 30 years, more or less since the end of the Cold War. Big political shifts in international relations and big economic shifts in international economic relations, or the international political economy. The essence of the big political shifts are a movement from post-World War II bipolarity, that is the Cold War, to the so-called unipolar moment, that is the breakup of the Soviet Union and of the Soviet bloc, and the 1990s as an era or a decade of really only one superpower, to a move towards rising multipolarity. And then I've got in parentheses here, or a new Cold War. In other words, multipolarity, but with a rising China as an aspiring superpower. I don't think China is yet. And some worries about a new bipolarity. In the dimension of international economics or international political economy, there's a different kind of trend going on that is slightly different, and that is what some people talk about in terms of networks and nodes. Other people talk about in terms of regionalization of trade, finance, production chains, technology, into three big regions: East Asia, centered, of course, on China; North America, centered on the United States; and Europe, centered on the EU. So a couple of quick charts. Oops, I can't actually read my charts because of the way this is displayed. completely, but this is kind of the simplest way of understanding relative power shifts is to just look at gross domestic product. And if you see from, look every 10 years from 1970 to 2020, you can see that the United States, which is, somewhere between a quarter and a third of the world economy in 1970, has dropped about 5 percentage points, but it's still in roughly the same territory. The rest of the G7, that is Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the UK, it's gone from about 31% to about 21%, so dropping about 10 percentage points. And of course, everybody knows China has increased enormously. Interestingly enough, though, the total share of the global economy accounted for by those relatively few countries has remained fairly stable. Or you can look at a different power index. This is one that I worked on called the Material Capabilities Index that takes an average, a mean of 5 different dimensions. So it has GDP, but it also has population, trade share, industrial capacity, and military spending. And you see the same thing, the same countries together account for about the same amount of hard power capabilities, but there's been a slight redistribution from the United States and a bigger redistribution from the rest of the G7 toward China. So rising multipolarity, but with some elements of bipolarity. And frankly, I didn't put a separate line for the EU here, which would obviously is slightly larger than the G6. But multipolarity depends on the EU hanging together, both politically and economically. And although this was clearly not Vladimir Putin's intention, the invasion of Ukraine has, of course, strengthened European unity, at least so far, which is probably good for Latin America because it enhances multipolarity rather than a new bipolarity. Here's a chart of trade flows. The point of this chart is that there are 3 nodes, the US, the European Union, and China/Asia. And there are those who bemoan and those who advocate new regionalization of trade. Of course, if you're sitting in Latin America, nodes and networks sounds a lot like coming again of center-periphery relations. So there's some worry. So, what are the implications of global shifts? Multipolarity increases the options, but it also increases the dangers of miscalculation. You can't necessarily count on your friends. You might think someone's going to do something and they don't, and it's dangerous. And of course, the classic illustration of the dangers of a multipolar system would be the events that led to the First World War. As I said, economic networks and nodes is kind of another way of saying regionalization, and maybe it's new center-periphery relations. So what's the best strategy for intermediate and small powers? I think it has 2 components. One, keep your options open. You want to have relations with various groups, and regional cooperation within regions gives you more influence at a global level. And I'm going to say later, but I may not have a chance to show you my slides on this or talk about it much. Even Brazil, which is clearly the largest, most capable in terms of hard power capabilities, sovereign state in Latin America, and certainly in South America, it's more or less half of South America. really, in my view, is still an intermediate power at the global level. It's not a major power. So if you think in terms of great and superpowers, major powers, which would be like France, Germany, Japan, and probably Russia and India, but not Brazil, then intermediate powers and small powers. So I think strategies of regional cooperation are important, both politically and economically. If you take that as desirable, then you get to, well, is this even possible? There are a lot of scholars as well as policymakers. You know, all of our friends, Andres Malamud, for example, who are very skeptical, who just say, well, you know, it's not happening. There are all kinds of reasons why it's not happening, and point to the difference between Western Europe and the European Community and European Union, and various efforts, recurrent efforts, to build regional institutions in either Latin America, South America, or even subcontinentally, like Mercosur. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute, and I'm going to argue that we need to two things. First, that the comparison with Western Europe isn't entirely fair, and I'm going to talk about why I think that's the case. And second, that I think we need to reconceptualize what we mean by regionalism or regional problem solving or regional cooperation. So first of all, you know, let's look at the outcomes. This is what everyone does. I said, well, look at the European Union. You know, there's only one peak organization for most things. It's unitary, it's hierarchical, it has elements of supranationalism, but also subsidiarity. So it's clear what's supranational, what's the EU, and what is for states. It's pretty well institutionalized. Of course, Britain left, but, you know, still got most of the European powers, and of course, has recently expanded. Well, compare that to Latin America. There are all kinds of multiple ways of constituting the region. There's the hemispheric inter-American system. There's just Latin America. There was ALBA, etc. It's duplicative, competing, prioritizes sovereignty. You know, people keep trying, but it's not well institutionalized. Oh no. Well, let's look at the conditions, sort of the conditions supporting regionalism. And here, the point of this table is that I want to argue that if you look at Western Europe in the couple of post-war decades, and you look at Latin America in the entire post-war period, you see that Western Europe had some huge advantages pushing regional integration that Latin America doesn't have. And if you consider that, the record in Latin America and in South America is not so bad. So first of all, pre-existing strong regional trade ties. If you go back to 1945, no, not in Western Europe. If you look at Latin America, well, not even today. And you know, there've been various kinds of attempts to create economic communities. The strongest ties in the region are within North America between the US, Canada, and Mexico. Common identity, history that is perceived within the region. Well, gosh, if you look at Western Europe in the aftermath of World War II, the French and Germans hated each other. And so on and so on. I mean, there was not a sense of Europeanness. I think there is much more of a sense of Latin Americanness in Latin America and South America, although, of course, less for Brazil, and the research of, you know, Janina and Amancio and various other co-authors, Fernando Moron and Francisco Ordinez, shows that the identity as Latin American is less in Brazil. And I agree that's a problem. But still, I would say more than you had at the end of the Second World War in Europe. Common external enemy is kind of a push towards regionalization, towards regional cooperation. And, obviously that was there in spades, as we say, at the end of the Second World War. Everyone was afraid, everyone in Western Europe was afraid of the Soviet Union. That was an easy way for the US to push, and the US did push very hard to get the French, the Germans, the Italians, the British, etc., to cooperate. There's no such thing in Latin America, has never been. In fact, the only external security risk for most of Latin America, most of the time, has been the United States, despite some efforts during the Cold War to say, no, we need to worry about the Soviet Union and Cuba and so on. Generous external funding for regionalism. The United States underwrote the creation of the European Community and the European Union, with the Marshall Plan. Nothing like it in Latin America. And finally, the existence of intra-regional multipolarity makes it oddly perhaps easier to create a region because countries are less afraid of being vulnerable to one another. So in Western Europe, on the continent, you had Germany, France, and Italy, and then to the extent that Britain was willing to play, there was Britain. So there was less fear, all of the things being equal, of being made vulnerable by doing things jointly. In Latin America, the only real multipolarity, the only real possible balance to Brazil is Mexico, but Mexico is in a special situation with North America. Within South America, a country like Argentina, understandably, is very nervous. So I'm going to say partial. So quick and dirty score, 3.5 of 5 dimensions for Western Europe in the early post-war decades, and only 1.5 for Latin America all the way from then till now. So, I think the structural systemic conditions have been much less favorable for Latin America. Given that, maybe we shouldn't be quite so critical of the achievements. So let's think about ways of conceptualizing regionalism that might be more inclusive and also more fair. I think that in terms of the way we think about global politics, not Latin America, but in international relations, we've moved from an idea that international cooperation only happens through formal international organizations, which was maybe an idea that was prevalent in the 50s and 60s and early 70s, or even more, to the idea today that we should think about global governance. And governance can happen in international organizations, but it can also happen in all kinds of transnational relations. It can happen through activist networks. It can happen through public-private bodies like the International IOSCO, International Organization of Securities Regulators, that has some governments as members, but in some cases, some countries, the stock exchange, many countries, the stock exchanges are private, so it's public-private, and so on and so on. So I think that if we, that in the studies of regionalism, we're still stuck on, it has to be through formal organizations, mostly, not entirely. And of course, Latin American scholars and Brazilian scholars and friends of ours have made advances in the direction that I'm pushing for. But if you look at this table, I have put actors on the vertical dimension and what I'm calling sphere of action on the horizontal dimension. So let's start with the horizontal dimension, the sphere of action in the second column, but the first output column, you've got internet. So reading across the top, international treaties and formal organizations only. In other words, the international organization approach. And the only actors would be sovereign states. So this is how we've mostly thought about regionalism, I think, in Latin America and South America, as something that RIOs do, regional international organizations, whether they be the OAS or the or UNASUR or CELAC or whatever. If it's not in an organization that's formally constituted, then it doesn't count. Now, if we think about what sovereign states can do, one way we can expand our understanding of regional cooperation or regional coordination and regional problem solving is to think about other kinds of state-to-state cooperation that doesn't actually rise to the level of being a formal institution. Say leaders summits. Now, leaders summits either regularly scheduled or that come about when there's a crisis. It's not quite the same as a formal international organization that exists and has a permanent staff in the headquarters, but it's not nothing either. And the institutionalization of the idea that when you have a pandemic or when you have a financial crisis, the first thing you do is you get on the phone and call your neighboring heads of states is important. And finally, if we look then at the other dimension, the actors dimension, we can expand our understanding of regional problem solving from sovereign states only to sovereign states and non-state policy entrepreneurs. So we could think about regional governance. And here I might refer to, both my own work on this, the second of the two papers that I sent is the introduction to a book on South American policy, regionalism, illustrating policy regionalism, sometimes multilateral, sometimes transnational, but carried out in various issue spaces like by transnational non-governmental organizations, epistemic expert communities, public-private regulators, and so on. And I would also like to highlight and refer to the work of Federico Merke, Oliver Stunkel, and Andreas Feldman, who are basically talking about the same thing. In fact, we cite them in our chapter. I think all of those types of regional cooperation or regional problem solving are legitimate, important responses to the big structural systemic situation that the world is in and that Latin America and South America are in. So this is the end of the formal slides. I wasn't sure how much time I would have, but I have some more if I've got more time. Can South America provide regional public goods? I think the narrow path to yes runs through a strategic and far-sighted Brazil. It's really, you can cooperate in the northern Andean region or in the Pacific. But if you want to cooperate in South America, Brazil has to play. And Brazil and its partners. And then my final big conclusion, just to repeat myself, is that in a world of multipolar international relations and competing regions in international political economy, regional cooperation in South America is itself a continental level quasi-public good. That is, it's not easy, it's costly, but it provides benefits from which no regional state is going to be excluded, even if they aren't, actively participating. That is also non-rival in many respects. Now, should I keep going? I have a couple more slides. I put them at the end because I didn't know if I would run out of time. Amancio?
Now you can go ahead if you want.
Yeah, okay. I was just going to show you. Let me just show a couple more slides. Specifically about South America, going back to kind of how it compares. I mean, I think this is really a response to the question, what about the BRICS? As you all know, I have written about the BRICS, and I think it's, the BRICS had their moment, and Brazil should certainly continue to cooperate with the BRICS. But, I don't think the BRICS are going to be sufficient. I think in the medium and long run, probably Brazil gets more by cooperating with its neighbors in South America. And if it doesn't, using this same power index, that kind of undervalues Russia because it doesn't have a component for having nuclear weapons. But you can see that at the global level, Brazil's an intermediate power. India is probably a major power, and Russia, I think, because of the nuclear issue. And finally, I think it's important to think about Latin America versus South America. In economic terms, in terms of this regionalization of the global economy, it's clear there's kind of a separation. If you look at groups of countries in Latin America and where their export markets are, I think you get 5 groups. The first group, overwhelmingly tied to the United States. That's Mexico. 84% of exports in the year that I looked at, which was 2018, 84% of exports going to the United States. I mean, that's huge. And similar statistics for most of Central America and the Caribbean. As you start to move downward, you get a split between exporting to the United States, to Latin American and Caribbean neighbors, and to East Asia. And that would be Guatemala, Belize, Colombia, Ecuador. There are few countries that actually export most to their neighbors, small countries, especially landlocked ones. North to south, El Salvador, Bolivia, Paraguay, Uruguay. Some big South American countries that now export more to China and Asia than the United States. And this is a huge shift, and it's, as everybody in this room, this virtual room knows, it's a shift that's taken place since the turn of the century. So 3-way shift, biggest to China and Asia, second to the United States, and a not inconsequential amount to Europe taken together. And then, of course, Venezuela these days, in the last 5 years, or at least, or 7 years, overwhelmingly exports to China and Russia. So, I mean, the big takeaway here is there's a bifurcation. I mean, obviously, Mexico doesn't have a lot of options. Mexico is in North America. I think the best option for Mexico is politically would be to make more common cause with Central America and the Caribbean, and Canada as a kind of second stage, and try to balance the United States within that. But as you move to South America, there's, I mean, the fear is, one, you want to maintain relations with, I mean, the strategic choice would be to maintain relations with both Asia and North America and the EU. The fear is you don't want to be left out. If economic growth and technological upgrading becomes more and more tied to regional value change, and in the United States, even under a Democratic administration now, there's all this talk about nearshoring and friendshoring and so on. You don't want to be left out. So it would be better to be balanced, sort of like to use international relation terms and kind of juxtapose them and put them in an economic context. You could say, bandwagon if you have to, but balance if you can, bandwagon if you must. And I think, just a slide about financial ties. It says the same thing. Mexico and North America's financial ties are mostly with the US, but South America's financial ties are much more diversified, and China is much more important. We all know that. Okay, that is, I think that concludes what I want to say. I have lots more things, but I'm going to conclude by saying again that I have a lot to say about the specifics of regional governance, but as someone who hasn't even been in South America since 2015, I think, whatever. I thought the most useful thing I could do was to kind of be this outside eye.
Thanks a lot, Professor. Before I pass the floor to Q&A section, I'd like to thank the presence of Professora Marta Hatch, Professor Eduardo Marx, Professor Glauco Pérez, and Manuel Galdini. So let's start the Q&A session. Please raise your hands, and I will give the micro for the questions. I'm not sure that are you able to follow the line, but I'll try. So the floor is open for you guys. Leslie, we have the rule here that the first question should be from the students. So professors cannot do the first question. So we need to wait for the first one. Otherwise, I can do that. Of course, if someone prefer can do that, can paste on the chat the question, but I prefer using the microphone. Do you mind if they ask in Portuguese or?
No, and if I have trouble, I would love that. And if I have
Okay.
trouble understanding, you can help me.
Sure, I will. Sure.
Claro que sim.
It's an opportunity to practice the Portuguese,
Sim.
right? But of course, you can answer in
Estou
English.
entusiasmada.
You can answer in English.
Yes. If I were in a physical room, I might ask for a show of hands, how many of you have gone out and worked for your candidates? It seems to me that, I mean, this is off the topic, but while we're both, I mean, much of the world is in a critical position with regards to the survival of liberal democracy.
Enquanto os colegas quebram o gelo, Leslie, eu gostaria de fazer uma pergunta muito ligada à questão política agora. Vou quebrar a regra, porque enquanto não chega uma pergunta dos estudantes, tá? Os estudos no Brasil a respeito de Emerging Power, a categoria de Emerging Power, deixou de ser usada durante o governo Bolsonaro. No entanto, os parâmetros internacionais do Brasil, do ponto de vista de poder relativo, se mantiveram, né? Embora o comportamento internacional mudou muito. Quer dizer, como é que dá um pouco a sensação de que o não alinhamento a democracias liberais e os argumentos e o comportamento em termos de multilateralismo, per si, colide com a ideia de emerging power. Me parece um pouco um posicionamento afetado pela questão política. Você tem a mesma impressão?
Okay, I think I understood all the pieces, but I'm not quite sure if I understood the question. Something about emerging powers, multipolarity, active
example of right-wing government as Bolsonaro. The concept of emerging power can be used or not. It's because he's a right-wing, we cannot use it, no longer this concept. It means that there's a confusion between political position and international attitude.
I mean, as I said, we are all struggling with, oh no, what happens if we get a government of the far right? I mean, I think in a sense, the structure remains, the structural imperatives remain, but countries have choices how they respond to them. And, you know, they don't, international relations is like the rest of social science. You don't have to make the right choice. You can have strong incentives to move in a certain direction. And I think my argument is simply that the incentives are there. The incentives have moved, both multipolarity in overall international relations and the sort of distribution of hard power capabilities, and this rise of economic networks and nodes, which is kind of the polite way of talking about it, or a more harsh way of talking about it is the new regionalization of economic international economic relations. They give countries certain incentives. Countries may not recognize that. But, you know, Brazil's position is crucial, but you can do, I mean, parts of South America can move ahead without Brazil. I mean, look at CAF, which I think is an important organization in the financial sphere. And by the way, in terms of calling out colleagues, I want to, in terms of financial regionalism, I also wanted to note the work of Maria Antonietta Lins, Tuca, and Andrea Hoffman, Ribeiro Hoffman. But, you know, you can have incentives. It can be rational to do something, but you might not do it.
Great. Please, Gabriela.
Oh, thank you. I would like to ask Professor Leslie how she sees the perspective of the reactivation of this integration process, such as Mercosur, after the emergence of conservative governments in South America.
I mean, ideally, what you want is processes that will continue irrespective of who wins the election. Now, I say that there's two kinds of conservatives. There's the conservatives who at least agree to respect the rules of the game, who will disagree on policies, but agree to respect the rules of the game. And there are conservatives, you know, those are sort of traditional conservatives. And then there's conservatives who are really more leaning towards authoritarianism, who will say, if I don't win, the election was stolen. As you know, the reason I'm wearing my T-shirt today is because I'm very worried about politics in the United States. I don't know if you followed the hearings that we've had over the January 6th invasion of Congress, instigated by former President Trump. But I mean, most of the Republican Party is still telling people lies. And most of the Republican senior officials that are now on the ballot in various states for governor and for members of Congress, our lower House of Representatives and senators, a slight majority are still telling people Trump won the election and he didn't. So that's, you know, to the extent that we're worried about your current president in Brazil planning to follow that playbook after the election, I mean, that's very worrisome. Hopefully we can get back to a more traditional sort of policy conservative, you know, someone who respects the democratic process, but who will say, look, you know, I want smaller budgets and blah, blah, blah.
Completely, and I completely agree with you, Professor. Thank you so much for your answer.
Janina, please.
Question?
Sure, go ahead, Janina.
I have a question. Leslie, thank you.
I
very
can't
much.
hear you very well.
No?
Before I could hear you.
You heard me?
Now I hear you better.
Oh, okay, thank you. No more questions from students? Then I have a question.
Mhm.
Thank you very much, Leslie, for your conference, for coming today. I would like to ask you about the United States, the relationship between United States and the other countries from Latin America, including Brazil. What is the today? What is the weight of the United States on the continent in terms of support of a regional integration, in terms of the interest from United States to establish cooperation, political cooperation?
I
with with the countries from South America in particular?
I don't think it's very high. You know, one, the United States is not thinking about it. Neither party is thinking about it. Two, if they do think about it, Latin America means Mexico, maybe Central America. But I think that actually supports my basic argument, which is that South America would be better off politically and economically to the extent it could cooperate more, whether formally through regional organizations or through leaders, you know, like-minded leaders working together in summits, or even not like-minded leaders working together. And through transnational, you know, expert communities and activists. One of the papers I sent has a case study in it. This is the first paper that's forthcoming in a special issue on the future of multilateralism, of the activities of what we political scientists like to call transnational epistemic communities. That is, in ordinary language, communities of experts, and how they've pushed the debate over the situation of soft currency countries and dealing with troubled sovereign debt. I mean, but the basic point is, I don't think Brazil has enough power, hard power capabilities or influence by itself. And even Brazil would have more influence internationally if it could cooperate with its neighbors. As I said, you know, there's some possibilities still for cooperation with the BRICS, but I think they're probably less than there were 10 years ago because of the way that both China and Russia have evolved.
Thank you, Leslie. Manuel Baldino.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can now. Yes.
Oh, perfect. First, thank you, Professor Leslie, for a speech today, a lecture. In the end of your talk, you mentioned about the possibility for Latin American countries, especially in South America, to diversify their partnerships. And I was wondering, what do you think are the possibilities for this strategy in the future if countries like the US and even the European Union, they decide to regionalize their production chain because they have the fear that several industries are strategic, and they couldn't afford the risk to depend on China or Russia on several products like ships, computers, etc. So right. In this scenario, like we see this with 5G technology. So in this scenario, what do you think is the possibility of the risks of trying to diversify and have commercial and trade partnerships with Asia, Europe, and the US, as we see now, as you mentioned in the slides?
Well, I mean, the short answer is the more power capability you have, you can aggregate, the less others will be able to ignore you. I mean, Brazil is an important country. no one can, United States, EU, China will not completely ignore Brazil, but Mercosur is more than just Brazil. And, you know, adding other countries in South America, adding the Pacific Alliance is more. I think that in essence, I'm saying two things, that power matters. And let me kind of give an aside there. People are always surprised when I say that, you know, in some way my approach is sort of neo-realist. It's not that I think power is good and countries should push one another around. I just think that as an idealist at a personal level, you have to think about power. But Brazil and South America need to decide what's best for themselves. And if they are big enough and united enough, other power centers, including, excuse me, economic power centers, will have to deal with them, even if they don't like everything they do. I mean, be France, if you like. France has, you know, if you grew up and study international relations in the United States, particularly like 70s, 80s, 90s, into the early 20th century. Now, France is always the one everybody's always mad at. Go back and read foreign policy analyses, you know, because France didn't do what the United States wanted much of the time. And various French presidents, one after another, criticized the United States. Did that make a big difference? Maybe not, because France was there and had to be dealt with. I mean, so I don't know if that's the best analogy, but be France.
Leslie, very quick question. BRICS, the BRICS can become a hard balance coalition, or is still as a soft coalition after Russia and the war with Ukraine? What is your perception of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the BRICS really were able to act because of the moment in time. The moment in time being the, you know, sort of the period from sort of the midway through the first decade of the 20th century, 21st century, for the next, you know, through the global financial crisis. I mean, what happens in the global financial crisis? In 2008, 2009, a couple of things. One, the G7 countries, and particularly the United States among them, realize they can't manage it by themselves. They have to call on a larger group of countries. So they have to call on the G20, which happens to be there. So they have the G20 first summit in order to manage the global financial crisis. And moreover, the emerging market countries actually come out of that crisis more easily, which we wish would happen this, you know, in future, but may not. But the point is that I think that moment is past. I mean, it's Russia, but it's also China. China has become much more obviously authoritarian. It's no longer following the strategy of you know, hiding its light under a bushel. It's making much more aggressive comments toward its neighbors. So all of a sudden, you know, ASEAN is much more united over the last 20 years than it was in the first few years of it, first decade or so of its existence. You know why? Because common external enemy that is threatening. So I don't think, I mean, I think Brazil should continue to participate in the BRICS. I know that some of my friends are campaigning hard to have, say, Argentina join the BRICS to give sort of South America more weight. I don't think you can, bottom line, you can't trust Russia or China to help you too much.
So, Janina, we can finish now. So, Leslie, thanks a lot for your excellent lecture. I guess the next time in person here in our next lecture in person, students will be less shy than virtual way. So I will recommend the students your paper, two paper, because the papers combine the theoretical aspect of international political economy and the evolution of regionalism. So they are excellent papers. So I recommend really strong for the students. And again, thanks to the Department of Political Science to open this session, so important to us, Professor Rogério Arantes and Professor Janina Onuti. So, thank you a
Muito
lot.
obrigada, gente. Até a próxima.
Até a próxima.
Let's see
or
what
both
happens
sides,
with
right?
our election, right?
Yes, I will be glued to my phone and my TV, and please pay attention to the US election a week or so later too, which is also very kind of existentially important.
Excellent. Bye-bye.